Clean this mess, or you're out. Ethan Brooks' voice cracked through the boardroom like a snapped wire, sharp enough to silence the low hum of $1,200 espresso machines and polished leather chairs. And the stack of contracts in his hand hit Maya Williams square against the shoulder before sliding to the glossy table and scattering across the floor, white pages fanning out under the cold overhead lights. No one moved, not the executives in tailored suits, not the legal team with their tablets frozen mid-scroll, not even the assistant beside her who had stopped breathing for a second too long, because everyone knew that tone, that edge, the one that meant someone had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed. Maya didn't argue, didn't flinch, just lowered herself slowly, knees bending with quiet control as her fingers reached for the pages, the faint smell of printer ink rising as she gathered them one by one, her hand pausing when her eyes caught a single paragraph buried near the bottom, a line most people would skim past, the kind written to sound safe, harmless, routine. Her thumb pressed lightly against the paper, leaving a faint gray mark, and for a second, the room shrank down to that one page, that one clause, that one decision about to be made. Behind her, Ethan exhaled impatiently, the subtle clink of his watch against the table cutting through the silence as he reached for his pen, gold tip hovering just above the signature line of a deal worth over $200 million. A deal everyone in the room had already mentally celebrated, bonuses calculated, promotions assumed. Maya stood back up, placing the stack neatly in front of him, her voice barely above a breath but steady enough to travel across the glass and steel. "Sir, don't sign page 14. And the words didn't land loudly, didn't demand attention, but they changed something, like a shift in air pressure before a storm, because a few heads turned, just slightly, a lawyer blinking twice as if recalibrating, another executive leaning forward without realizing it. Ethan let out a short laugh, not amused, just dismissive, the kind reserved for interruptions he didn't consider worthy of time. "That's not your concern," he said, pen lowering closer to the page. But Maya didn't step back, didn't retreat like she was expected to, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the document, on that line, on the quiet danger hiding in plain sight. Somewhere to the left, a tablet screen lit up as someone scrolled faster, fingers tapping, breath tightening, and then it happened, subtle at first, a furrowed brow, a pause, a second look at the clause that had seemed harmless seconds ago. And suddenly the room wasn't silent because of authority anymore. It was silent because something didn't feel right, and Ethan's pen stopped just a fraction of an inch. Above the paper, hovering there, suspended between certainty and doubt, as he glanced down again, slower this time, as if for the first time, and without realizing it, the most powerful man in the room had just hesitated because of the one person he had tried to silence. The pen did not touch the paper, not yet, and that fraction of an inch suddenly felt heavier than the entire room, heavier than the deal itself. As Ethan Brooks narrowed his eyes and flipped the page with a slower motion, the soft drag of paper against polished wood sounding louder than it should have, while across the table one of the attorneys leaned forward, his chair letting out a quiet shift, fingers sliding the document closer as if pulled by something he could not explain, and Maya Williams remained still, her hands now empty at her sides, the faint gray smudge of ink still marking her fingertips, her breathing even, controlled, like she had already said everything that mattered. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a sharp, controlled breath, the kind he used when something irritated him more than it should. "Page 14. He repeated under his breath, not as a question but as a test, and the room followed him there. Eyes dropping, screens lighting up, the quiet tapping of keys beginning to ripple around the table as legal assistants scrambled to cross-check the clause, the energy shifting from certainty to calculation in seconds. One of the senior partners adjusted his glasses, reading once, then again, his lips pressing together as if the words had rearranged themselves the second time. "This clause," he began, then stopped, his voice catching just enough to be noticed, and Ethan looked up, not at Maya, not yet, but at the man he trusted to confirm everything. Before a signature ever happened, and for the first time, that trust wavered. "It transfers post-merger liability," the partner said carefully, choosing each word like it might collapse under pressure, "entirely to us." And the sentence landed without sound, like a drop in deep water, but everyone felt it, because that was not what they had been told, that was not what had been negotiated, and that was not what Ethan Brooks signed deals for. A faint hum returned to the room, not from machines, but from people thinking too fast, recalculating outcomes. Consequences, headlines that had not happened yet, and Ethan leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking under the shift, his pen now resting between his fingers instead of hovering, his gaze finally lifting, not sharp this time, not dismissive, but searching, and it stopped on Maya. She did not look away, did not lower her eyes the way most people did when his attention landed on them. She simply met it, calm, steady, as if the moment belonged to the truth and not to him. "Explain," he said, the word quieter than before, stripped of its edge but not its authority, and Maya took a single breath, the kind that settles something inside. "It is written to sound like a shared risk clause," she said, her voice even, clear. "But the language allows the other party to redefine compliance after the deal is closed, which means any dispute, any loss, any legal exposure shifts back to your company entirely." And she did not rush, did not dramatize, just laid the facts out like they had always been there, waiting to be seen. Across the table, another screen turned, numbers flashing, projections adjusting, and someone muttered under their breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but loud enough to confirm the same realization, and Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when control slips for a second and reveals what almost happened. The pen in his hand lowered fully now, resting against the paper without signing, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the silence had changed again, no longer forced, no longer imposed, but earned, and in that silence, the assistant no one had listened to a minute ago had just rewritten the outcome of a $200 million decision. No one reached for their coffee, no one checked their phone, because something irreversible had just entered the room, something quieter than authority but stronger than it, and Ethan Brooks felt it before he could name it. The subtle shift where control did not disappear but changed hands without asking permission. He looked back down at the page, slower now, tracing the clause with his eyes the way he had not done in years, not because he could not read it, but because he had trusted that someone else already had, and that trust now sat in front of him, cracked just enough to let doubt through. "Run it again," he said, his voice low, steady, directed at no one and everyone. And immediately the room responded, laptops opening wider, documents pulled up on multiple screens, the legal team speaking in quieter tones now, not confident, not certain, just careful. Maya did not move, but her presence no longer blended into the background. It anchored something, like a fixed point in a room that had started to tilt. One of the junior analysts swallowed, scrolling through the digital copy, highlighting the section, then expanding the subclause beneath it, his cursor blinking like a pulse. And then he froze, just for a second, long enough for the partner beside him to notice, to lean in, to read it for himself. And the reaction passed between them without words, a tightening of the jaw, a slow inhale. "There is an override," the analyst said finally, voice quieter than he intended. "It allows them to reinterpret compliance after execution." And that was it. That was the missing piece, the part no one had caught because it was not meant to be caught, hidden behind language that sounded protective but functioned the opposite. Ethan leaned forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table, the pen now completely still in his hand, no longer a tool of decision but a reminder of how close it had come, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Maya, without making it obvious to everyone else, as if he was still deciding how much of this moment belonged to her. "How did you see it?" he asked, and this time it was not a challenge, not an attempt to reassert control, but a question he did not already have the answer to, and that alone changed the air between them. Maya blinked once, slow, thoughtful, as if choosing which version of the truth to offer, then said, "Because it is not written to be read quickly." And the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else, because it exposed something no one in the room wanted to admit, that speed had replaced attention, that assumption had replaced verification. A faint shift moved through the executives, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to register, shoulders adjusting, posture tightening. The realization that their certainty had been built on something fragile. Ethan's gaze held on her a second longer than necessary. And for the first time, there was no dismissal in it, no impatience, just calculation mixed with something unfamiliar, respect not yet formed but beginning. And then he looked away, back to the table, back to the contract, but not back to the man he had been 5 minutes ago. "We are not signing today," he said, and the finality in his voice returned. But it carried a different weight now, not dominance, not ego, but decision shaped by interruption. And no one argued, because everyone in that room knew exactly why, even if only one person had seen it first. Chairs shifted quietly against the polished floor as the meeting dissolved without the usual closing remarks. No confident handshakes, no satisfied nods, just a controlled retreat of people who had almost missed something they could not afford to miss. And Ethan Brooks remained seated a second longer than everyone else, his fingers resting lightly on the untouched pen, his eyes still on the contract as if the words might change again if he looked away. The door opened and closed in soft intervals, footsteps fading down the hallway, until the room that had been filled with certainty minutes ago now held only 2 people and the low hum of air conditioning. Maya Williams gathered the remaining documents with the same steady rhythm she had started with, aligning the edges, smoothing the pages, her movements precise, almost invisible, like she had practiced disappearing even while standing in the center of everything. Ethan finally leaned back, exhaling slower this time, not sharp, not impatient, just measured, and he set the pen down on the table with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the quiet. "You read contracts like that often," he said, not looking at her yet, his tone neutral but no longer dismissive, and Maya paused for just a fraction of a second before placing the final stack down, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I used to," she replied, simple, direct, without embellishment. Ethan's gaze shifted then, landing on her fully, studying not just what she had said but how she said it, the absence of performance, the absence of any attempt to impress, and that unsettled him more than confidence ever could. "Used to," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, just unfinished, like a sentence waiting for its second half. Maya glanced briefly at the glass wall, her reflection faint against the city skyline stretching beyond, cars moving in distant lines, lives continuing without knowing how close a decision had come to changing everything inside this room. And then she looked back. "Things change," she said, and it was not defensive, not regretful, just factual, like gravity or time. Ethan stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a controlled sound, and for a moment he seemed taller, not because of authority, but because something in his posture had shifted, less rigid, less certain, more aware. He walked around the table, stopping a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but not so close that it crossed a line he had never noticed before. "You saw something my entire team did not," he said, and this time there was no edge, no accusation, just acknowledgement forming in real time, and Maya did not respond immediately, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper stack, grounding herself in something physical, something steady. "It was there," she said quietly. Anyone could have seen it. And Ethan let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but softer, more honest, because they both knew that was not true, not in the way it mattered. He nodded once, a small motion, almost private, and then his eyes shifted again, not to her face this time, but to the faint ink marks still visible on her fingertips, a detail he would not have noticed an hour ago, a detail that now felt significant for reasons he could not fully explain. "Stay," he said after a moment. The word simple, but carrying something new, not an order, not a command, but a request shaped like one, and Maya's expression did not change, but something in the air did, subtle, quiet, like the beginning of a shift neither of them had planned for. The word stayed between them longer than it should have, simple, quiet, but heavier than everything that had just happened, and Maya did not move right away, her eyes holding his for a brief second before shifting down to the table, to the stack of contracts that had nearly sealed something irreversible. "Stay," he had said, but it did not sound like the man who had raised his voice minutes ago. It sounded like someone recalculating in real time, someone adjusting to a truth he had not expected to need. Maya let out a slow breath, barely visible, and straightened the last page again even though it was already aligned. A small action to buy a second, to think without making it obvious. For what? Exactly, she asked, her tone even, not challenging, not compliant, just precise, and Ethan paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer he had a few minutes ago no longer fit. He glanced toward the empty chairs, the screens now dim, the room stripped of its audience. And for the first time, the absence of people made the moment clearer instead of easier. To go through it, he said, gesturing lightly toward the contract, line by line. And there was something almost unfamiliar in the way he said it, like he was asking for time instead of taking it. Maya studied him for a moment, not the suit, not the title, but the shift, subtle but real, the difference between being spoken at and being spoken to. And then she nodded once, small, controlled, as if agreeing to something larger than just a document. She stepped closer to the table, the soft sound of her shoes barely registering against the floor, and turned the contract slightly, angling it so both of them could see, her finger resting near the margin but not touching the text yet, as if waiting for permission that had not been given out loud. Ethan moved beside her, not across from her this time, the distance between them closing just enough to change the dynamic, and he leaned in slightly, his shoulder no longer squared in authority but angled in attention. Start where you saw it, he said, quieter now, and Maya nodded. Again, her finger tracing just above the clause without pressing down. It is not just this line, she said. It is how it connects to the ones above it. And she moved upward, guiding his eyes through the structure, not rushing, not assuming, just showing, piece by piece, how something that looked stable could shift under the right conditions. Ethan followed, not interrupting, not correcting, his focus narrowing in a way it had not during the meeting, because now it was not about proving control. It was about understanding something he had missed. The city outside the glass continued moving, cars flowing in steady lines, sunlight reflecting off distant windows. But inside, time slowed, measured not in minutes but in details, in words that carried weight only when read carefully. Maya paused at one section, her finger hovering again. This is where it changes, she said, and Ethan leaned closer, his brow tightening slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration, the kind that comes when something important begins to make sense. He did not speak for a few seconds, just read, absorbing, recalculating, and then he nodded once, almost to himself, the realization settling in without resistance this time. When he finally looked at her again, it was different, not just acknowledgement, not just curiosity, but something closer to respect, still forming, still unspoken, but present. And for the first time since the meeting began, the power in the room did not belong to position, it belonged to clarity, and he knew exactly who had brought it there. The words settled into place not with noise, but with weight, and Ethan Brooks felt it in the quiet shift of his own posture. The way his shoulders lowered just slightly as understanding replaced assumption, and Maya Williams stepped back half an inch, not retreating, just creating space for the idea to exist without her holding it there. The contract lay between them, no longer a finished decision but an open question, and Ethan's hand moved toward the page again, not to sign, but to turn it. Slower this time, his fingers brushing the edge with a kind of care he usually reserved for numbers that mattered more than people. If this had gone through, he said, not looking at her, his voice measured, almost reflective, we would have carried everything. And Maya nodded once, her gaze steady on the document. Yes, sir, she replied. But there was no fear in her tone now, no hesitation, just confirmation. He let out a quiet breath, the kind that did not release tension so much as acknowledge it, and he leaned his weight against the table, the polished surface cool beneath his palm, grounding him in a moment that felt more significant than the deal itself. Why did no one else catch it? He asked, not accusing, not defensive, just trying to understand the gap between what should have happened and what almost did. And Maya did not answer immediately, her eyes moving across the page once more as if retracing the path she had already taken. Because everyone trusted the summary, she said finally, her voice soft but clear, and the summary was written to be trusted. And that landed harder than any mistake, because it was not about competence, it was about habit, about speed. About the quiet way systems teach people where not to look. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the realization, unfolding in layers. And for a second, he looked past the contract, past the table, toward the empty seats where his team had been, as if seeing them differently now, not as extensions of his control, but as people who had followed a pattern that had never been questioned. The silence returned, but it was no longer tense. It was thoughtful, like the space between two lines of a conversation that mattered. Maya shifted her weight slightly, her fingers brushing against the faint ink mark on her skin, a small reminder of how she had entered this moment, not as someone invited to speak, but as someone who chose to. "You could have said nothing," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, more personal than before, and Maya glanced up at him, not surprised by the statement, just aware of what it meant. "Yes," she said simply. And that was all. No explanation, no justification, just the truth of it. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, something unspoken passing through his expression. Not gratitude yet, not fully, but something close, something forming beneath the surface of everything he had built his identity on. He straightened slightly, pushing away from the table, but not stepping back into his old stance, not reclaiming the distance he used to keep, and instead he remained there, within the same space, within the same frame of reference, as if acknowledging that whatever had shifted was not temporary. "We are going to rebuild this from the ground up," he said, his tone steady, decisive, but different now, shaped by the interruption that had changed its direction. And Maya nodded again, her posture relaxed but attentive, ready not because she was told to be, but because she understood what was at stake. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware that inside a glass room on the upper floor, a decision had been undone not by power, not by authority, but by someone who refused to look away when it mattered most. The room did not return to what it was before, not even close, because something subtle had taken hold, something that did not raise its voice but refused to leave, and Ethan Brooks felt it in the way he no longer looked at the contract as a finished object, but as something alive, something that could shift depending on who was paying attention. He walked back toward his chair, but did not sit immediately, his hand resting on the backrest as he glanced once more at the pages spread across the table, the edges no longer perfectly aligned from earlier, a small disorder that now felt more honest than the polished arrangement from before. Maya Williams remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence steady, grounded, like she had already accepted whatever direction this moment would take. "Walk me through the rest," Ethan said, his voice calm. But there was a different kind of urgency beneath it now, not rushed, not pressured, but intentional, the kind that comes when someone realizes the cost of missing something once. Maya nodded slightly and shifted the document again, her finger moving down the page, tracing the structure not just of words but of intent. "This section defines compliance," she said, her tone even, and Ethan leaned in just enough to follow, his attention no longer divided, no longer scanning for highlights, but absorbing each line as if it mattered on its own. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was working, filled with the soft rhythm of reading, the occasional turn of a page, the faint hum of the building around them. "Here," Maya said after a moment, pausing again, and Ethan felt the shift before he fully understood it. The same quiet signal that had stopped him earlier, and he focused, reading slower, deeper, until the pattern revealed itself, not obvious, not bold, but consistent, a design meant to pass unnoticed. "It repeats," he said under his breath, more to himself than to her, and Maya nodded. "Yes, it builds," she replied. "Each clause supports the next one." And the realization settled in layers, not as a single mistake, but as a system of them, intentional, structured, precise. Ethan straightened slightly, his hand moving to the table, fingers pressing lightly against the surface as if grounding himself again. And he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, not from stress, but from the weight of understanding something that could not be undone by simply stopping the signature. "We would have signed this," he said quietly, and this time it was not a statement of what almost happened, but an acknowledgement of how close it truly was. Maya did not respond right away, her gaze still on the document, her expression unchanged, but there was something in the stillness, something that suggested she had already accepted that reality before anyone else in the room had even considered it. Most people would have, she said after a second, not as comfort, not as reassurance, just as truth, and Ethan glanced at her again, not sharply, not searching, but recognizing the absence of judgment in her voice, the absence of anything that would make him defensive, and that, more than anything, made the moment land harder. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, and then moved around the table again, this time taking his seat, not at the head, but closer to where she stood, a subtle shift that no one else would have noticed, but one that changed the angle of everything between them. Sit, he said, the word quieter now, not a command, not even a request in the way it had been before, but an invitation shaped by respect, and Maya hesitated just for a fraction of a second before pulling out the chair beside him, the soft sound of it sliding across the floor marking the beginning of something neither of them had planned, something built not on position, but on the simple fact that she had seen what others had missed, and he was no longer willing to ignore that. The chair made a soft sound. As Maya Williams sat down beside him, not across from him, not at a distance, but within the same frame of thought, and that alone changed the rhythm of the room, because Ethan Brooks was not used to sharing space like that, not in decisions that carried weight, not in moments that defined outcomes. The contract lay open between them, no longer a document to approve, but something to dissect, to understand fully before it could be trusted again, and Ethan adjusted it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small act of control that felt different now, less about dominance and more about clarity. Go on, he said quietly, and Maya nodded, her finger moving again, slower this time, not just pointing, but guiding. This section looks routine, she said, but it references a definition that changes later, and Ethan followed, his eyes tracking the connection, not skipping ahead, not assuming, just reading, absorbing, recalibrating his understanding with each line. The sunlight shifted slightly through the glass behind them, casting a faint reflection across the page, and for a moment the words blurred, not because they were unclear, but because they required more attention than they had been given before. It is layered, Maya continued. Each part depends on the one after it. And Ethan let out a faint breath, nodding once as the structure revealed itself, not through complexity, but through intention. A design meant to reward speed with confidence, and punish it with consequence. He leaned back just slightly, enough to see the full spread of the document, his fingers tapping once against the table, not impatiently, but thoughtfully, a habit that had always meant he was processing something deeper. This was deliberate, he said, more to himself than to her, and Maya did not contradict him, did not confirm it either. She simply let the silence hold the conclusion, because it did not need to be argued. It was already visible, a notification lit up briefly on one of the abandoned screens across the room, then faded, unnoticed, because everything that mattered was now contained in the quiet space between them, in the lines of text that had nearly been overlooked. Ethan turned another page, slower still, his attention unwavering, and for the first time in a long time, he was not relying on summaries, not relying on someone else's interpretation. He was reading, fully, completely, as if the outcome depended on it, because now he knew it did. You said you used to do this, he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, not interrupting the flow but adding to it, and Maya's hand paused briefly, hovering just above the margin before continuing. Yes, she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, not defensive, not proud, just factual, that made the word carry more weight than a longer explanation would have. Ethan glanced at her. Again, not with curiosity this time, but with a growing recognition that the person beside him did not fit the role he had assigned to her earlier, and that realization did not threaten him, it recalibrated him. Then you know what this becomes if it is signed, he said, and Maya nodded once, her eyes still on the document. Yes, she said quietly. It becomes a problem you cannot solve later. And that landed with a different kind of finality, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. Ethan closed the page slowly, not ending the review, just pausing it, his hand resting flat against the paper as if holding it in place. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence now was not about tension, It was about understanding, the kind that settles in after something important has been seen clearly for the first time, and in that stillness, the roles that had defined them earlier felt less certain, less fixed, as if the room itself had quietly decided that what mattered most was not who spoke first, but who saw the truth when it was there. The quiet did not break. It deepened, settling into the space between them like something earned, and Ethan Brooks kept his hand resting on the closed page for a moment longer than necessary, as if letting the weight of what almost happened fully register before moving on. Then slowly, he lifted his hand and opened the document again, not out of doubt, but out of discipline, the kind that forms when a mistake is avoided just in time. "There is more," he said, almost to himself, and Maya. Williams nodded slightly, already aware, already ahead of that realization, her eyes moving to the later sections of the contract without hesitation. She leaned in just enough to shift the page, her finger tracing downward to a section most people would have never reached with the same level of attention. "Here," she said softly, and Ethan followed, his posture mirroring hers now, not leading, not directing, but aligning. The clause looked ordinary at first glance, standard phrasing, familiar structure, the kind that blends into every agreement without raising concern. But the more he read, the more the pattern returned, subtle, consistent, intentional. "It ties back," he murmured, connecting it to what they had already uncovered, and Maya nodded. "Yes, it completes it," she said, and the simplicity of her words made the structure clearer than any legal explanation could. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing not in frustration, but in focus, the kind that sharpens when something important becomes undeniable, and he tapped the table once, not out of habit, but as if marking the moment internally. "They planned for this to pass," he said, and this time there was no uncertainty in his voice, just recognition, and Maya did not respond immediately, her silence confirming what did not need to be spoken. Across the room, the city moved in steady lines, sunlight shifting across glass buildings, but inside, time remained slowed, measured in details that could not be rushed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a brief second toward the empty seats again, not with blame, not with frustration, but with a new understanding of how easily something critical could be missed when everyone believed someone else had already seen it. Then he looked back at Maya, fully this time, no hesitation, no distance. "You caught all of this on your own," he said, and it was not a question, it was a realization forming out loud. Maya's hand rested lightly on the edge of the paper, the faint ink mark still visible, a quiet trace of how she had entered this moment, and she nodded once. "Yes," she said, "nothing more." Because nothing more was needed. Ethan held that for a second, the simplicity of her answer carrying more weight than any explanation, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough to change the way he saw her, not as an assistant, not as someone assigned to support, but as someone who understood something he had nearly signed away. He straightened in his chair, his posture settling into something new, not rigid, not relaxed, but intentional, and he closed the document once more, this time with clarity instead of pause. "We are going to revise every section," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but grounded in what had just been uncovered, and Maya nodded again, her presence unchanged, steady, as if this was simply the next step, not a reaction, not a moment of recognition, just the continuation of doing what needed to be done. And in that quiet agreement, something became clear without either of them needing to say it, that the decision in this room was no longer about avoiding a mistake. It was about redefining how decisions would be made from this point forward. The decision did not echo, it settled, firm and quiet, as Ethan Brooks reached for his phone but stopped halfway, his thumb hovering just above the screen, as if the instinct to act had arrived before the clarity of how to act had caught up. He lowered the phone slowly and looked back at the contract, then at Maya Williams, the shift in his attention no longer subtle, no longer divided, but deliberate. "If we revise this," he said, his voice measured, "they will know we saw it." And Maya did not react immediately, her gaze resting on the document as if the answer was already there, embedded in the structure they had just unraveled. "Yes," she said after a moment, calm, steady. and they will adjust. And the implication hung in the air, not threatening, not dramatic, just real, because whoever had built this had not done it casually, and they would not ignore being exposed. Ethan leaned back slightly, the leather chair giving a soft response under his weight, and for a second, the room felt smaller, not confined, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been removed. So we do not just fix it, he said, more to himself than to her, his eyes narrowing in thought. We change how it is structured entirely. And Maya nodded once, her expression unchanged, as if this conclusion was simply the next logical step. Outside the glass, a cloud shifted, dimming the sunlight just enough to soften the reflections on the table, and the contract between them lost its sharp contrast, the black text blending slightly into the page, but the meaning behind it had never been clearer. Ethan picked up the pen again, not to sign, but to mark, drawing a small line beside the section they had just discussed, a quiet signal that this was no longer untouchable, no longer accepted as it was. We rebuild from here, he said, and this time the words carried direction, not just intention, and Maya leaned in slightly, her finger moving to another section, already identifying where the structure could be reinforced, where clarity could replace ambiguity. The rhythm returned, not of reading, but of working, of two perspectives, aligning without needing to compete, and Ethan found himself asking questions he would not have asked earlier, not because he lacked the authority, but because he had assumed he did not need to. What would you change first, he said, and Maya paused for a fraction of a second, not uncertain, just choosing the order, then pointed to the definition clause. This, she said, because everything else depends on how this is interpreted. And Ethan followed, nodding once as the logic unfolded, clean, direct, undeniable. He made another mark, then another, the page slowly transforming from something finished into something in progress, and with each adjustment, the gap between what had been assumed and what was now understood became clearer. You are not just reading this, he said after a moment, his tone quieter, more reflective. You are rebuilding it. And Maya's hand stilled briefly, her eyes still on the page. I am making it say what it is supposed to say, she replied, and the precision of that answer landed with a different kind of weight, because it was not about correction, it was about intention. Ethan looked at her then, not quickly, not casually, but fully, and something in his expression shifted again, not in a way that could be named easily, but in a way that changed how he occupied the space beside her. He set the pen down for a moment, his hand resting flat against the table, grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened and what was about to follow. And then he reached for his phone again, this time without hesitation, unlocking it with a practiced motion. He did not dial immediately, though, his thumb pausing just long enough for one more thought to settle, one more realization to take shape. And when he finally looked up, his gaze met Maya's with a clarity that had not been there before. Because the next decision he made would not just affect the deal, it would redefine who he chose to trust moving forward. The phone remained in Ethan Brooks' hand, unlocked, the screen glowing softly against his palm, but he did not move immediately, his thumb hovering as if the weight of the next action required more than just instinct. And for a brief second, the silence between him and Maya Williams deepened again, not uncertain, not tense, but deliberate. Then he turned the phone slightly, angling it away from himself, and placed it face down on the table with a quiet, controlled motion, as if choosing to delay the outside world just a little longer. Not yet, he said under his breath, more to himself than to her, and Maya did not question it, her focus still anchored on the document, her presence steady, unaffected by the shift in his decision. Ethan leaned forward again, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his attention returning fully to the contract, not as a problem to fix quickly, but as something to understand completely before anything else moved forward. If we call them now, he continued, his voice low, measured, we react, and he paused just long enough for the implication to settle. But if we finish this first, we control it. And the distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Maya nodded once, not because she needed convincing, but because she recognized the shift, the movement from urgency to strategy, from response to intention. Her finger moved again, guiding the flow. Then we finish it, she said simply, and the clarity in her tone matched the clarity of the moment. The two of them leaned back into the work, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving through the structure with a rhythm that had formed naturally between them, a quiet synchronization built on attention rather than hierarchy. Ethan began marking more sections now, not randomly, not reactively, but with purpose. Each line he drew signaling a decision, a correction, a reclaiming of something that had almost been lost. The pages filled with small notations, subtle but precise, transforming the contract from something that had been accepted into something that was being shaped. Here, Maya said again after a moment, her voice steady, and Ethan followed without question, his eyes tracking the connection she indicated, his mind already anticipating the pattern, already adjusting. Before she finished explaining, he nodded once, then made another mark, the motion smooth, confident, but grounded in a different kind of certainty than before. Time moved quietly around them, the building humming, distant footsteps passing in the hallway, the city beyond the glass continuing without pause. But inside, the focus remained unbroken, anchored in the details that now mattered more than anything else. After a few more minutes, Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand resting on the table, the pen still between his fingers, and he looked at the document as a whole, not just the parts they had corrected, but the structure they had rebuilt. "This is different now," he said, not as a question, not even as a statement to her, but as an acknowledgement of the transformation in front of him. Maya glanced at the pages, then back at him, her expression calm. "It says what it means now," she replied. And the simplicity of that answer carried a finality that no legal language could replicate. Ethan held that for a moment, the weight of it settling in, and then he reached for his phone again, picking it up with a steadier hand this time. The hesitation gone, replaced by clarity. He unlocked it, scrolled once, then pressed a contact, lifting it to his ear as he stood, his posture no longer rigid, no longer distant, but grounded in the decision he was about to make. As the line began to connect, he glanced back at Maya, just for a second, and in that brief look, something unspoken passed between them. Not acknowledgement alone, not just recognition, but trust beginning to take shape, quiet and real. As the conversation on the other end picked up and the next phase of the decision finally began. The call connected with a soft click, and Ethan Brooks turned slightly toward the glass, not to distance himself, but to steady his voice, the city stretching out in front of him like a reminder of everything that depended on what he said next. "We are not proceeding with the current draft," he said, calm, direct, no hesitation, and on the other end, there was a pause, just long enough to register surprise before it was masked by professionalism. Ethan listened, his gaze steady, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, fingers brushing against the marked pages, grounding himself in the work they had just done. "No," he continued after a moment, his tone firm but controlled. "We found inconsistencies in the liability structure, and we are revising the framework entirely." And as he spoke, he glanced back at Maya Williams, not for confirmation, but because her presence had become part of the decision itself. She sat quietly, her hands folded loosely on the table now, the faint ink marks still visible against her skin, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she understood that this moment was not about her being acknowledged, but about the truth being carried forward. The voice on the other end responded again, faster this time, layered with careful questions, subtle attempts to redirect, to reframe. But Ethan did not shift, did not adjust his position, his answers precise, measured, leaving no space for ambiguity. "We will send a revised version," he said. And there was a finality in the way he spoke that did not invite negotiation, only acknowledgement. The call ended quietly. No raised voices, no conflict, just a line drawn where one had not existed before, and Ethan lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the table beside the contract. For a second, he did not speak, his eyes resting on the pages, the marks they had made, the structure they had changed, and then he exhaled. A breath that carried both the weight of what had been avoided and the clarity of what had been chosen. "They knew," he said, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion, and Maya tilted her head slightly, considering the statement before responding. "They hoped it would not be noticed," she said, and the distinction settled into the room with quiet precision, because it shifted the moment from suspicion to understanding. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, and then he reached for the contract again, flipping it open not out of necessity, but out of intent, as if reaffirming that what they had seen would not be overlooked again. "We send this version," he said, tapping lightly on the revised sections, "and we watch how they respond." And Maya nodded, her gaze steady. "That will tell you everything," she replied, and there was no doubt in her voice, no uncertainty, just a calm certainty built on what they had already uncovered. The light outside shifted again, brighter now, reflecting across the glass and casting a soft glow over the table, over the pages, over the quiet space that had transformed into something more than a meeting room. Ethan stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a controlled motion, and he looked at Maya, fully this time, not as someone passing through his day, but as someone who had changed its direction. "You could have stayed silent," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal than before. And Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said simply, and the honesty of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could. Ethan held that for a second, the realization settling in deeper than before, and then he nodded once, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because in that moment, the decision that mattered most was no longer about the contract. It was about what he chose to do with the clarity he had been given, and who he chose to trust when it mattered most. The room felt different now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something intangible had settled into place, something quieter than authority and stronger than it. And Ethan Brooks stood still for a moment, his gaze resting on Maya Williams, as if seeing her fully for the first time, not through the lens of a role, not through assumption, but through what she had revealed simply by refusing to stay silent. The contract lay open on the table, marked, revised, transformed, no longer a trap waiting to be signed, but a statement of clarity shaped by attention and truth, and the sunlight coming through the glass reflected softly across its pages, no longer cold, no longer distant, but warm in a way that felt earned. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that does not rush out but settles, and he stepped closer to the table again, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he looked down at the work they had done, then back at her, and for a second, he did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything he had said before. "You changed the outcome of this room," he said finally, his voice quiet, steady, stripped of everything unnecessary, and Maya did not react immediately, her eyes moving briefly to the document, then back to him, her expression calm, grounded, as if she had not done anything extraordinary, only what was necessary. "It was already there," she replied softly, and the simplicity of her words carried the same weight it had from the beginning, not seeking recognition, not needing it, just stating what was true. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, and there was no trace of the man who had raised his voice earlier, no impatience, no dismissal, only a clear recognition of something he had almost overlooked, and something he would not overlook again. He straightened slightly, his posture no longer defined by distance, but by presence, and he reached for the contract one last time, closing it gently, not as an ending, but as a completion of what this moment required. "We move forward with this," he said, tapping lightly on the revised pages, "and we do it differently from now on." And the words were not directed at a team, not broadcast as a statement of leadership, but spoken in the quiet space between them, where they carried more meaning. Maya nodded once, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, the faint ink marks still visible, a small reminder of where this had started, and for a moment, neither of them moved, because the silence had become something else entirely, something steady, something real. Ethan glanced once more at the city beyond the glass, the movement, the scale, the constant motion of everything outside, and then back at her, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that did not need to be named to be understood. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a question that mattered now in a way it had not before, and Maya held his gaze for a second, her answer coming without hesitation. "Because this is where I am needed right now," she said, and the honesty of it settled into the space between them with quiet certainty. Ethan exhaled softly, a faint nod following, as if accepting not just her answer, but everything it represented. And then he stepped back slightly, not creating distance, but allowing the moment to stand on its own. The room remained still, the light steady, the contract closed, and in that stillness, something had shifted that would not shift back, not in how decisions were made, not in who was heard, and not in how he would ever look at the person standing across from him again. Because she had not raised her voice, had not demanded to be seen, and yet she had changed everything simply by choosing to tell the truth when it mattered most.